next we come to something which I've been looking forward to reflecting upon this month because I watched in increasing surprise and horror um, over the weekend a couple of weeks ago, as well as NBC News, and we've gone with NBC News here because they're a third party. They're outside the UK looking in. Um,
Yeah.
went with the headline: Far right demonstrators gather in London to protect symbols of UK history. Now,
Yes.
as one of our favourite radio commentators outlined as it was happening, or as it was about to happen,
Yeah.
rather, sorry. No, actually, as it was happening, wasn't he? He was essentially sort of saying, so people have turned up to protect statues from people who have not turned up to destroy those statues, and instead have turned their attentions on the police who are there to make sure that everyone can do their protesting safely and also protect the statues. Now that's like a slightly convoluted way of putting it, but to put it another way, far right people went down to London on a jolly on the train, drank a heck of a lot when they when they arrived in
Yes.
Parliament Square and other places. Were expecting a fight with Black Lives Matter protesters who had been talking about, for example, toppling statues like Winston Churchill, who had
No,
been
no, no, no. Black Lives Matter. I must stop you there. Black Lives Matters people had not been talking about toppling the
no
statue of Winston
fringe, no,
Churchill.
no, so fringes
Some
of it,
some
yes.
people on the fringes of that movement had previously floated the idea that, for example, the statue of Nelson and the statues of Churchill should be taken down because of aspects of their characters and conduct.
Yes, yes. Now,
Very different thing.
no, it's true. Okay, fair enough. With that in mind, though, the government, for example, boxed in Churchill. He was in a great big fridge, essentially, a fridge box, which is very reminiscent of our prime minister. Actually, he likes to hide in fridges as well. Um,
Absolutely.
and nothing happened. The Black Lives Matter and other related groups did not turn up. They instead they went to other places. I think Hyde Park was one of the places where they did gather.
Right.
But they specifically avoided conflict,
Yeah.
I think quite rightly. And now you had a whole bunch of people who were very riled up, not necessarily the most intelligent people in the world, and I'm not speculating there. The videos show it for themselves. Drinking a lot, and now ready essentially, and requiring in some ways a fight, and they ended up going off on the police. I think 22 officers ended up being injured during the course of the day,
Yeah.
and uh, and it was just a huge act of muppetry because actually at one point, and one of my one of the people I follow on Twitter pointed this out, that it was truly bizarre to see people who were protecting Winston Churchill, someone who has various controversial aspects to his character, particularly, for example, if you're Australian and other from other parts of the world.
Mm.
Protecting Winston Churchill, who is most well known in terms of his life for fighting and standing up against fascism, um,
Mm.
by at one point saluting the statue with
A
fascist
straight right
salutes,
arm. A
straight
straight
right
right arm.
arms. Um, it was weird, wasn't it? It was really weird, and it was a very serious act of muppetry in that sense, wasn't it? Um,
Yeah, and yeah, and for to avoid confusion, we are talking about the Muppets of the month here.
yes. Oh,
Um,
sorry, did I not make that clear?
no,
Sorry. Well, no. Okay, yeah. Sorry, but I think
yes, no,
maybe because it's so serious. I think that's possibly.
absolutely, yeah,
Yeah,
yeah, yeah,
yeah,
yeah, absolutely.
yes. But yes, Muppet of the
Although
month.
although it is black comedy,
Yeah.
um, very very dark comedy, certainly. No, you had as you say, you had people live tweeting and TV the 24-hour news channels live streaming confrontations on Whitehall in front of a cenotaph
Mm,
with a line of at a police barrier with these guys from organisations like there's one called the Democratic Football Lads Alliance who claim they're anti-racists,
okay.
but that is debatable, shall we say.
Mm,
They're associated with people like Tommy Robinson. They might mean something to people in the UK. Certainly, he's a right-wing rabble rouser who has a strong following on social media. He's done time for contempt of court for tweeting and the images of people involved in a controversial grooming trial in the north of England, amongst other things. But yeah, that you had this scene at the police barrier being shown on live TV, where lines of the Mets finers were being confronted by what looked like extremely pissed up members of the Football Lads Alliance. Other anti-fascist groups are available, doing straight right arm salutes and trying to provoke the police to have a pop at them.
Sorry, so the anti-fascist group was doing fascist salutes. I
I
see.
was speaking. I was being ironic. I was being ironic. But then, to give you an idea of the febrile kind of atmosphere that we were in, this is in the week following Colston, and at the same time, Poole Council down in Dorset was first of all saying it was going to remove the statue of the founder of the Scouts, Robert Baden-Powell, who held his first Scout camp on Brownsea Island in Poole Harbour. They were going to remove his statue because he is on the record as having expressed sympathies for Nazism.
Yeah, and also taking inspiration in some ways for Scouts from Nazi youth groups, etc.
Absolutely, absolutely. And then they were met by, again, people turning up, including people from these same groups of football fans and so on, who were going to defend Baden-Powell's statue. And the council then did a reverse ferret and said, well, they were going to consult about it and everybody should calm down a bit. And we also had the funniest one, or at least left to the. It's a serious situation. There was one extremely fun. I think anyway, it's really funny joke that came out of it, where a group again of the same people turned up in Coventry to protect the statue of George Eliot, and the novelist, and the joke was that they probably get really riled when they got there and found out that the statue of George Eliot had been replaced by a woman.
Okay, right, fair enough.
George Eliot, of course, being the pen name of a woman writer.
Yes, actually, yes, yeah.
So, yeah.
Well, I mean, something that kind of tickled me about this, and again, it's weird how, it's funny in a very dark way. There's lots of this stuff because it was a stain. It's a real stain on so-called post-European Union Britain to have this sort of thing happening. Sorry, the thing that
hang on. Mark. The immigration bill passed yesterday, and according to the Home Office, we should be celebrating the fact that we can no longer live, love, and work in the countries of the European Union freely.
Indeed, yes, I should be celebrating my the freedoms that have been taken away from me. Yes, I should.
Absolutely.
But no. So the thing that made me laugh and made me giggle was when I saw the next day on Twitter. Apparently, a bunch of Wrexham lads, inverted commas, had turned up in Manchester and basically chased the fascists out of the middle of the city. So a bunch of guys got on. Wrexham, I should say, is probably the nearest largish football club to where I grew up, unless you count Rill and Prestatyn FC, which not many people do. These Wrexham guys turn up on the train, and you have these very carefully staged, actually, little moments on being filmed where you have people who are on these other football people who are probably on the right, as we would describe it, suggesting that they've turned up and that they have IRA links. Presumably because they're not from England, oh, it must be IRA. It was really weird, but also quite funny. I saw tweets where people were saying, "Well, if Wales ever gets independence, you know who'll be the SAS equivalent, don't you? Send in the Wrexham boys."
I celebrate this. Wales has an honourable tradition of anti-fascism. Particularly, it sent a lot of members to join the international brigades in the Spanish Civil War, particularly from South Wales coalfields. So and Welsh collier skippers ran coal and food, coal out and food in, and arms in to the ports of northern Spain during the Spanish Civil War. So there's a long and honourable tradition of fighting the fash in Wales.
Yeah,
So
yeah, and also
I'm happy to celebrate
yeah, and also fighting overbearing English culture. But anyway, so one of the
that.
one of the more bizarre things to come out of this though was when Benjamin Sutton, amongst other people on Twitter, noticed that things had been left behind at the base of Churchill's fridge compartment.
Oh, yes,
Um, the
the neo-pagan element of this, the
Yeah,
offerings.
it's almost like neo-pagan. The actual tweet here that I picked up on was, "Are those offerings?" It was like, "Are those ellipsis offerings?" Question mark. And the offerings, as far as I can tell, include a tin of tuna,
Mhm.
two bananas, two packets of mini rolls, which are sort of chocolate-covered Swiss rolls for those of people outside the UK, a tin of sardines, and possibly a small bag of grapes. Possibly, I'm not quite sure what the final thing is there. Um, and then
It's
around,
like some bizarre sort of alt-right feeding of the 5,000, isn't it? It's,
yeah,
presumably Churchill would come down off his pedestal and distribute this largesse to all the guys that were present, and it
yeah,
would never run out. The
indeed.
only thing that's missing there are the cans of a Heineken and Special Brew.
I think so. I think so. Well, actually, in front of the statue, there's some other stuff. I'm not quite sure what that other stuff is. That might be a bottle of something actually,
Oh, right.
uh, but it was just weird. It was really really strange, and it may not have been. I mean, it might not be offerings. It might just be that, but they've been left so carefully. It is like as if yes, they're offering something up to Churchill. Very strange. Very strange.
But I think if we're talking about the reaction
But
to
archaeologically interesting as well, though.
monuments,
So go on.
well, and I think, but also and the reactions to this, absolutely, in terms of the way people celebrate or mark moments
Mm,
in, but also I think the uncontrolled dynamic of it was, I think, shown up by something that happened just a few tens of meters away from the Churchill statue,
mm,
where another one of the demonstrators was photographed urinating on or next to
mm,
the
yeah,
memorial to PC Keith Palmer, who was murdered in the precincts of the House of Commons by an Islamist terrorist
yeah,
a couple of years ago.
yeah.
Something that's very personal to us here in South East London, particularly Charlton fans, because Keith was a season ticket holder at Charlton Athletic, our football club.
Right.
And so that was very emotional for
Mm,
people. The person that did that was tracked down, charged very quickly, and sentenced to 2 weeks in prison.
yeah.
Now, I'm sure that actually they didn't turn up at that event intending for that to be the end result. They didn't intend to end up massively disrespecting somebody who
No.
gave their life in the cause of, defending, by extension, the thing that represents us as a country, the House of
Mm,
Commons.
mm.
But that's what happened, and so that
Well,
specific
crucially, it's
moment
what
of
happens when you turn up somewhere. You don't really know where you are, and you've drunk a lot.
yeah,
To be
exactly.
blunt, it's what happens. That's and
Yes.
and and yeah. I haven't. I wouldn't. I'm not going to say that it hasn't happened and doesn't happen, but I haven't seen anything, for example, around the Colston statue protest that these people were apparently reacting to that
No,
was remotely similar. I don't think there was any
no,
reports of people defecating or urinating anywhere where they shouldn't be during
no.
that.
Or even drinking vast amounts of alcohol.
No, exactly.
This was a very
Or looking for a
it,
fight. Yeah.
absolutely.
Mm,
This was almost the kind of ritual that used to take place in the 1970s and early to mid 80s
mm,
between groups of football fans who would they'd they would the various firms, you taking that term from the criminal underworld for an organisation,
hmm
various firms associated with various clubs. The Chelsea Headhunters are one of the most famous.
hmm
But they would agree to meet other groups of fans outside a particular pub or at a particular place on a Saturday before or after the match to have a fight.
mm.
And it still happens to a lesser degree, and certainly that kind of behaviour seems to have been at least partially transferred to this alt-right culture war expression of defending, the
Defending
our
Englishness.
history,
Yeah.
defending our identity,
Mm,
our history.
mm.
So, you know, it's plus de chance, plus de même chose. But on the other hand, yeah, serious level of muppetry to say you're defending the person who was instrumental in keeping Britain in the war and defeating fascism by using the salute that was adopted by the other side,
Yeah.
shall we say?
Yeah. Well, and in a very serious way, it was an affront. It was. I found it personally disgusting. But
Yeah.
there was some little sparks of light though coming out of the protests. Reuters news agency picked up on the fact that uh, suspected far right protester was rescued. A man identified by the crowd as a far right protester was carried to safety by a Black Lives Matter protest on Saturday as animosity was briefly set aside on a day of clashes in London between police and rival groups. Pictures showed a white man clutching his forehead. No, sorry, his head, as a black man carried him over his shoulders, flanked by police in riot gear. The man had been set upon on the steps leading to the Royal Festival Hall in central London and was badly beaten before other protesters stepped in to protect him, Reuters journalists at the scene said. And for my money, I mean, I know, so I know you're about to just mention something, but for my money, this
Mm.
image itself is worthy of a statue. There's something statuesque about it. A very strong looking man holding another man who's injured, and carrying him out despite
It's,
being at odds.
I think, mm.
Hmm.
I think one of the reasons that image is so resonant is not just the image of the black person carrying the white
Hmm.
protester in amongst that dynamic of racial intolerance.
Yes.
But there are two things. One is it's very reminiscent of the famous statue. I think is it New York or Chicago? It's the statue in America, which gave rise to the song "He Ain't Heavy, He's My Brother," which was an older boy carrying a younger brother on their shoulders.
Hmm.
It was done for a Catholic charity, if I remember correctly, a
Hmm.
Catholic
Hmm.
orphanage, and it comes from a story that when somebody asked this lad, "Are you okay carrying your brother? You're carrying that person, carrying the kid on your shoulder. He must be really heavy."
Hmm.
And the little boy replied, "He ain't heavy. He's my brother,"
Yeah.
implying that there's that universal brotherhood,
Hmm. Hmm.
actual and universal brotherhood. So it's very reminiscent of that particular, very iconic
Hmm.
cultural moment. But I think the other thing as well, which made it subsequently even more powerful, was the revelation that apparently the person that was being carried and had been on the far right, was identified as a far right demonstrator, was in fact a former police officer.
Yeah.
So there were all sorts of dynamics within that, particularly in the light of Black Lives Matter,
Hmm.
which grew out of what is now a case of murder in the United States, George Floyd being allegedly murdered. And I'm only saying allegedly because the court case hasn't been completed
Yeah.
yet, by American police officers.
Hmm.
So there was so much resonant about that. But it's interesting, you talk about it being worthy of a statue, and yeah, and it may well be. But it's interesting how already there is talk of memorialising the Colston event as a
Hmm.
statue. So, for example, the idea has been floated. I think it was by Banksy,
Yes.
of replacing the Colston statue on its plinth, but having it being toppled by further figures standing on the ground as protesters, and therefore having the debate about the event in the rearranged statue, if you like, or the reconfigured statue.
Hmm.
So that we're in a very live situation at the moment where, on the one level we can have these, I think, actually very positive debates about
Hmm.
identity and about history and about how we represent things that have been underrepresented in the past, and how we, look at historical events in the round rather than from a particular self-interested viewpoint.
Hmm.
But at the same time, there's this febrile atmosphere which is leading to, it has to be said, violence on the streets of
Of
our
London.
cities.
Sorry, I just heard. I
And
heard the song
and
in my head. Sorry.
yeah, Yeah,
No, it's panic in it. So panic, panic on the
yeah,
streets of London. Yeah, yeah.
yeah,
Um,
yeah.
well, not
No, but
to.
it's like the Jam and the Damned Zone. They almost wrote the soundtrack for where we are at the moment.
Yeah, no, I think so. I think so. Well,
I lived
okay.
through it. The worst is I lived through it the first time. Uh, I'm
Yeah,
that old and sad.
yeah. Well, actually, I'll never forget. Not that long ago, there was an older, I think, an old lady on the news who was very disappointed that we're having to live through a time when we're seeing people claiming fascism as their legitimate political standpoint.
Yeah,
And she's like, haven't we? I thought we did this, kind of thing. And this is someone who unfortunately is unlikely to see it resolved in her lifetime. It's a
yeah.
genuine shame. But anyway,
Uh,
so go on, go on.
no, I was just going to make the point though, in terms of where we are and where we are culturally. There was a family friend who is now a very senior manager at the BBC, in fact,
Hmm,
of South Asian background, um, but recalls in southeast London in the late 70s, early 80s, running away from football gangs like the Chelsea Headhunters and so on,
hmm,
the kind of thing we were seeing, on that Saturday.
hmm,
Um, it's you know it although in many ways we've moved on as a society and that person can have the career that they've had,
hmm.
at the same time some of this we haven't outgrown this really dark sludge at the bottom of our society either.
No. Well, and but I, because that's a particular note to end that on. But I suppose what I would quickly just add to that is that uh, I grew up not too far from that sludge, which doesn't mean arguably actually I live not too far from it as well. Now I've always lived in a deprived part of the UK wherever I've
Mm.
been, a socio-economically deprived part, even though I've been lucky enough to go to
And I
great
think
schools.
can I just say I need
Oh
to make
no,
clear I'm not attacking individual human beings
no,
here,
no,
but
no.
some of the attitudes that they can embody.
Yeah, no, precisely. And this is what I was about to say was that, and in that sense, individually, person to person, the people who will carry these sorts of ideas with them, people, frankly, who even have been in my family, I'm ashamed to say, who carry these ideas with them, will be perfectly personable. They'll be
Mm.
absolutely meet withable. You can even have a drink with them and disagree with them, and they're not going to smash you, over your head. But there's
All of them
some,
anyway.
but there's something about the fact that those ideas continue to be
Yeah.
um, to have power, particularly when they're reinforced in a group. When someone goes, "Oh, I'm not alone. I feel that as well. I think this as well," and then it grows and it is dark. It is a sludge, and I suppose that's one of the questions: is how do we bring people up out of that without giving them a sense that they've somehow lost something, or rather that other people are gaining at their expense.
That's the point. I said that's the point. I think you look if you look at the history of those kind of attitudes, they often come about when individuals or groups are othered by
Yeah.
politicians
Mm,
for a particular reason because they're trying to as a distraction or because they see it as a platform to
mm,
build their own
mhm,
access to power on or their own path to power on. So, for example, when it comes to racism in the UK, you have two groups in society, black people and people of South Asian origin, who are most associated as communities with areas of deprivation
mm,
and underachievement in some cases underachievement in education and so on, and yet they're still seen and painted as a threat to
mm.
people whose skin's the same colours as yours and mine, which is nonsense. You
That's
know,
well, that's true. Although to fold it back towards what I was just sort of talking about, in so much as that equally though, there are people who aren't from those ethnic minorities who suffer in very similar ways. I
mm,
think, for example, Akala touches on this in his book,
indeed.
Natives. Was it Race and Class in the Ruins of Empire? And
Yeah,
so for example, in Glasgow, here in Newcastle, in North Wales, you have people who in County Durham, in the old pit villages, you have people who feel as though they've been left behind, and who
yes,
are actually academically. often less achieving less well than, for example, even poor black ethnic minority people, for example, in inner
mm,
city boroughs in London. Um, and and when the answer, political answer, is to throw money at people who look a certain way or people who
yeah,
behave a certain way, often that's even more fuel to the fire in these places where people feel as though they are being left behind. And it's so easy to just, for Tommy Robinsons of this world, to drop a match into those scenarios. And
absolutely.
whereas actually the issue often is actually class. It's not just race. It's also the fact that you can take someone
Mm,
from say Grenfell, and someone from certain parts of Glasgow, and their economic outlook is precisely the same,
yeah,
despite how they look. Um, and so,
yeah,
it's unfortunate that often actually people in power benefit from telling the person in Glasgow, or the equivalent of the person in Glasgow, is actually the person from Grenfell that's your enemy. It's not me,
yeah.
even though I have several houses and a position on a international business board.
Can,
Um,
can I can I make another point as
this
well?
has
And
all
it's
got
sort
very
of same.
serious, hasn't it, for the Muppet of the Month?
It had
Like,
well, but also let me try and turn around the super tanker. No, uh, let let me try and develop this into our next and final segment, which is normally our media picks.
mhm.
And it's not a media pick I was going to make, but it's one I can add in here because it's directly relevant to what we've just been talking about. Um, Last night we sat down to watch something I recorded a while back, and I'd actually watched first time, but I'm watching it again. It was a BBC documentary about the Yorkshire writer Barry Hines, who's most famous for writing a book called Kes.
Mm,
In the late 1960s, it was an iconic paperback novel when I was growing up, with a young teenager film, black and white. It's still taken from the film that was made of the book.
mm,
A young teenager, Billy Casper, flicking a V sign at the reader who's picking up the book
mm,
as a sign of defiance and individuality and so on.
mhm, mhm,
And it was fronted by the comedian and former teacher Greg Davis.
mm,
Um, and I found it incredibly moving, but also quite depressing because Barry Hines was one of a generation of working class writers and artists who grew up after the Second World War in the world of free education,
mhm,
where education was something you could aspire to. He was good enough to be having trials as a footballer, a young footballer for Manchester United, but by one of those strange quirks in history, became a novelist and a playwright.
mm,
Wrote also a very famous play called The Price of Coal.
mhm,
Was associated with the left-wing film director Ken Loach, who directed Kes, the film of Kes. And it struck me watching it that in terms of aspiration, in terms of hope, in terms of defiance, in terms of saying it doesn't have to be like this, but by the way, your culture and the things that are good in your culture, like solidarity and helping, looking out for each other, and even playing football together in the team. And so on are things, they're nothing, they're not to be ashamed of, they're not to be looked down on, they're actually things to be proud of.
yes.
But that kind of um, very strong representation in British popular culture has really largely disappeared since the early 1980s,
Mm,
when education became much more commodified
mm,
and everything was given a price in political culture by people of the left and the right.
mm,
Um,
mm.
and so,
And there was a
um,
sort of gentrification of the salt of the earth type of person, wasn't there? That
that
was that was seen as the ultimate and best destination for all such people.
Exactly, and
Yeah.
now, although there are still writers who are addressing these kind of issues, and you talk about the Northeast, Lee Hall
Mm,
being one of them,
mm,
most famous probably still for writing Billy Elliot,
mhm,
the film and then the musical, which is
mhm,
obviously set, but it's set. Billy Elliot is talking about working class culture and actually the death of working class culture, certainly the working class mining culture.
mm,
But he's looking back at it retrospectively.
mm. Yeah.
Um, and it's not been replaced with anything.
No. No. No, indeed. Yeah. It's been left to fester. Yeah. Um, okay. Well, I think that was a really good. That was. I think we tackled that quite well. I think that was really good. We faced what was a very difficult weekend there. I think with a good conversation. There are a couple of other headlines that we wanted to bung into the Muppet segment, which are a bit more light-hearted, and I'll put the links below. But there's no need to talk about them in any depth really now, because of time concerns. One of them being,
They're almost one-liners.
well, they are, yes, yeah. So one of them being the headline: "The ancient Peak District stone circle was damaged by campfires." That was definitely an act of Muppetry. And the other one being a copy of Spanish Baroque painting botched by amateur restoration. This is very similar to that infamous picture of Jesus that was restored
Yes.
a few years ago.
Yes.
So we'll put those
Melting
in
Christ.
exactly. Yes, yes. So we'll melting Christ. We'll put those below as well as part of this segment.
Uh,
But
Actually, doing the research for that, there was Melting Christ, there was Playmobil St George, and various others. There's only one serious point to be made about that, which was made by one art historian, which is that in Spain, and actually, I think probably in most places, there's actually, unless something's actually specifically protected in law, uh, and this picture wasn't, anybody can set themselves up as an art restorer and say, yeah, I can do that.
yeah, yeah.
Um,
So
you know.
expertise and regulation.
On the other hand, if you get it right and manage to turn a massive restoration from of a not particularly well known or particularly good painting from possibly a studio or admirer of Leonardo, you can turn it into an original Leonardo and sell it to a gallery in the Gulf for many millions of pounds. Oh, not that that would ever happen, of course. Allegedly.
Allegedly.